joining. This is the Building a Sentry, 7 years of open source React. You're going to be hearing from me, Evan Perkaiser, and this guy, David Wang. I guess we can kind of start out here with some quick intros. So yeah, who are we? Like I said, my name's Evan. I've been here at Sentry for 4 years now as a full stack engineer. I'm on this team called the Core UI team, and I guess I can kind of explain a little bit just what that is, because I think the name isn't like super descriptive. But kind of the idea here is that we've kind of noticed as almost any like kind of engineering organization has grown, this kind of natural thing happens where you initially, when you're small, kind of everyone is just working on everything, kind of covering all the corner cases of everything. But as you grow as an organization, you start to have teams that specialize more in like specific things. So the thing that happens when teams specialize is you have kind of these cracks that form within the things that are getting worked on, right? So maybe you start having kind of all these specialized teams, and then little things just kind of start getting forgotten about, or like just no one owns them, right? Like at some point, for example, you might have like, oh, no one owns the Webpack build, and then it's just like anytime like someone needs to do that, they kind of have to like find time to make that happen, kind of thing. So the idea of this Core UI team that we have here at Sentry is that we're sort of the team that fills in those gaps, that is tasked with the things that are almost like not thought about, and we think that those are like kind of the really important things to make the product really good, right? It takes it from being like a product that works really well to a product that feels really good. So like I said, my name's Evan. You can read about my likes, dislikes. I don't like nested conditionals, please. Only early returns only. And then I'll kind of flip it over here to David.
Yep. So hey everyone, I'm David, and you can see we have this little setup in the corner where whoever's talking is like the bigger, I guess, floating head. So this is really easy to see who's talking. But yeah, I've been here at Sentry for now 2 years. I'm a full stack engineer, and I'm the second engineer on the Core UI team. And I really have 2 engineers, so it's a relatively small team. I also have my likes and dislikes here. I didn't really know what to put for dislikes, so I guess I don't really dislike anything specifically. I actually
likes everything.
Yeah, I thought pretty hard about this, but I couldn't really put anything down. But that's what I like. So yeah, we're getting right into this. So we've introduced ourselves. I think it's due time that we introduce the product that we work on. So this is Sentry. Perhaps you've heard about us. Maybe you use us at your own company, or maybe on your own projects. But I'm going to go ahead and take some time to explain the justification over why you might want something like Sentry in your application, and then go through a quick demo just so you have more context about all the things that we're talking about here today.
To be clear, it's not mad. We're just want to give some context so that makes all sense.
Yeah, just to inform the audience here, right? So we have Sentry. The way I like to explain it is typically through like a simple example. So probably all developers here, say you have a side project going up, and it's a simple like checkout page, maybe like an online store, right? So you have this online store, and it has a couple of pages. Like I said, it has a checkout page, login, authentication, all the basic things that you have in a full stack web app. And you go ahead and you deploy your online store out to the public, and inevitably you're going to get some users that run into issues. And initially, if you're just handling a very small user base, what might happen is they'll send you emails, and one user might be like, oh my gosh, the checkout page doesn't work. I have all these products in my cart. I'm trying to get these products, but they just don't check out. I get this big red error on my screen. And then you have to engage in this back and forth with this customer. And there's probably some better channels for it, but say you're just doing it over email, there's a lot of back and forth. And if they're a nice customer, they might send you some more information, like what browser they're using, the version of the browser, if they can even get that for you. Maybe they can even go into the logs, like the console, if they're really good, and they can send you all these things. And it's really nice. You can have this back and forth, but obviously this isn't very scalable. Say you have thousands of customers. You can't be having these day-to-day interactions when you're trying to build out new features. So this is where something like Sentry can come into play. If you put Sentry into your application, anytime users run into errors, we're going to float up an error into a dashboard, and you can view that basically whenever you have time, or you can set up alerts on that. So that's what we're going over right now. So I'm going to flip over to Sentry. We have a test organization. This is actually the sandbox feature that we recently created. And You can get to this yourself if you go to the Sentry webpage. So you go sentry.io/welcome. There's a sandbox demo, and you can just register for that. And you can, poke around Sentry yourself. So you're encouraged to do that if you want to check out more afterwards. And we have this organization. It's called Peaceful Rhino. And this is just like a test name. Don't worry about that too much. And also on the right-hand side here, there's the My Projects. And for example, this is like a full stack web app, and we also had like mobile applications. So we had Android, iOS. We support a variety of different languages through our multitude of SDKs. But because this is a React conference, I'm going to go ahead and select React. And these are examples of issues that users can actually run into. So this reference error, for example, I'm going to click into this, and this is an actual issue. You can see that scrolling down, we have certain contexts that we want. So the version of the browser they're on, for example, maybe the actual user that you have, their email. So you can look into more logs in the database. And you have even the OS. And scrolling down even further, we can see that there is the Stack trace, which is arguably some of the most important information you can have here. And even you can track breadcrumbs. So if you want to see specifically what happened leading up to this issue, you can look at this through the list of breadcrumbs that we have here. So I'll just scroll through that real fast. So this is super useful already. And I think typically when people use Sentry, they think of it as primarily like an error monitoring service, but we also offer things in the form of performance too. So we have performance monitoring. So we're on the React project, so it's going to show us Web Vital data. This is the, front-end performance. This is like Google Web Vitals. They have FCP, LCP, first input delay, and a bunch of other things that you might find useful for diagnosing the performance of your application. And you can see, because it's an online store, we have the checkout and product store transactions that are going on here. And then finally, you can view this as kind of more of like a passive way to consume Sentry. You see issues, you might log in once a day to look at some issues and look at some performance things, make sure the app is working as planned. But if you want to set up some alerts, you can also do that. So I'm going to go over to alerts now. And this is like a proactive way to use Sentry, I guess, in the sense that you can set up an alert rule. And this can be based on issues or volume of errors or even some performance metrics. So you can see, maybe the checkout page is taking too long. Maybe there's been a performance regression, or there's a high volume of errors on the login. Users can't get into their accounts. So this is all super useful. And maybe now that you've seen this, you have an idea of, on the next side project you build, you might want to use this. And yeah, ever since I've, worked here, I use Sentry on a lot of my side projects.
Yeah, I can't live without it these days.
Honestly, can't live without it. It just feels so much safer to deploy things when you have visibility into what's going on the user end. So yeah, that's Sentry. And now that we've introduced ourselves, the product, we're going to give a quick outline of what the talk is going to be going over, right? So what is this talk about? You're going to be learning a couple things. First off, you're going to see firsthand what a large-scale React TypeScript code base looks like, and you're going to hear directly from us, two engineers who work pretty closely with it, how we build it, how we maintain it. And you're also going to be exposed to the front-end developer experience here at Sentry. You can see all the tooling that we use, the decisions that we've made along the way, what works best for us, and why we've kind of made these decisions. And then you're also going to see a couple interesting, or rather gross parts of the Sentry code base. You're going to see some stuff that probably you shouldn't replicate, and we'll talk about it in more detail, and feel free to ask any questions about that. And finally, hopefully, after all that, you can step away with a working knowledge of techniques that we've used in Sentry to keep the code base modern and maintainable, despite how long we've had a history with React here. And you will be looking at actual code in our editors, not mainly a lot, but we'll show off some cool things that we like, right? So you're encouraged to follow along here at github.dev/getsentry/sentry. And this is, if you don't know about this feature, it's super cool. You can see like a web editor for VS Code in here, and you can just kind of follow along. And you're encouraged to ask any questions in Discord along the way. So basically what's going on is only one of us is going to be talking at a time. So the other person will primarily be looking at the Discord, make sure, any questions are flagged up, and we'll pause every now and then, and, we'll get these questions answered. So definitely don't save them for the end. We want to interact with y'all as much as possible. And with that being said, I think it's time to hand it back over to Evan, and he's going to go over our tech stack.
Thanks, David. Yeah, like David said, definitely ask questions whenever. We kind of wanted this to sort of be in maybe a little bit more of the form of the discussion, just, ask about decisions we made, why we made them, stuff like that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about just kind of like stuff that we use, why we use it, things that we like, just within our tech stack. And, like I said, a lot of the stuff you guys have probably seen. It might just be kind of nice to hear why we use it. Obviously this isn't a backend talk in any way. This is definitely, all React front end. This is a React conference. But I did want to kind of mention that Sentry is powered by Django, the kind of like backend side of things. It's mostly these days, it's a kind of just Django is the backend API, and then the React front end app is more or less almost a single page application at this point. So most of when you're using Sentry, you'll be in React land where it's just making API requests to Django. We're not real fancy. We're not using GraphQL or anything like that. We're kind of still using kind of the classic REST patterns for things, but we found this works pretty well. That said, it's not always true. Like I said, we've been using React for quite a long time, 7 years now. I actually was like trolling back through the commit log just to like validate that we've been using it that long, because React was introduced, I think, by Facebook in 2013. So we have been using it for a pretty long time. But kind of the point that I wanted to make here is that, it's not obviously not always true that it was a single page application, or at least it wasn't born that way. For a pretty long time, it was kind of the classical, like, Django rendered views. I put Jinja here, and I feel like some people in the Discord are probably like, Django views aren't Jinja, but to me, they're very similar. Yeah, so like even today, we're actually still not 100% completely a single page app. We still have a number of views that do render in the back end, and we have to kind of have some code in the way that like we handle the front end app to like make sure that it can delegate back to pages where they don't render the React views. So one of those pages actually that is probably maybe not obvious, but is the most obvious, at least to us, is the login page and the authentication page. That stuff's all still not in React and barely uses any JavaScript, actually. I think the only JavaScript that we use is for the tabs where you can swap between sign in and single sign on. I think there might be like a little bit of JavaScript that we inject for like a password strength meter. So yeah, all right. One of the first things I want to mention here is that we're really big TypeScript fans. So we just finished our migration over to just being completely 100% a TypeScript app. I think our tests are still mostly normal, like vanilla JavaScript, but we actually have been converting our tests over to TypeScript as well. We have a really, really great blog post about this that we put up. It's on our blog. Definitely go check it out. I think we'll probably talk a little bit more in this talk a little bit later on, just kind of what we like so much about TypeScript. But we won't talk too much about kind of the journey for getting over to TypeScript. It took us about, I think, a year and a half, maybe close to 2 years.
I think it's like 2 years.
But we definitely kind of found the benefits were very, very much worth it to get there. So wanted to mention that. In terms of how we actually kind of like compile and build the application, it's kind of all the usual suspects. We've got Webpack, we've got Babel. We do still have a little bit of using the Less compiler for CSS. I guess I probably should have put the next slide after or before this, because we use some style component stuff. So that's why we don't have quite as much Less. But I was going to mention that Babel kind of does most of the work here. So we actually don't use the TypeScript compiler at all. We only use the TypeScript checker to, obviously do the type checking. But I think we have, the way that it works is that it runs as a forked background process. So when you start Webpack in dev server mode, it will kind of fork off and run a TypeScript checker, but it actually doesn't use the compiler at all. We have Babel configured so that it just kind of strips off all the type annotations. So Babel is doing most of the work. That said, we also kind of have a pretty, I think, kind of unique Webpack configuration. And the reason that we kind of have this unique Webpack configuration is because of the fact that Sentry.io exists. Sentry for a very long time has been an open source product. And because of that, when you run a SaaS version of an open source product, you inherently have to have probably some closed source code. So the closed source code for Sentry is mostly the completely uninteresting billing code, like the Stripe integration type stuff. But we do have a number of things on the front end that need to be basically in the Sentry.io app. So what we've done is we have, Sentry, get Sentry/Sentry on GitHub, which is the open source code base, which has, I'd say, 95% of the code that, runs Sentry.io. And then we have this other closed source repository that just has kind of like things like, I don't know, like upsells and like other like billing related, UI elements. But Webpack is kind of, we've configured it in such a way so that it can compile both Sentry, the open source stuff, and then Get Sentry actually augments Webpack and adds a few more entry points. That way, Get Sentry is the closed source repo. That way it can compile all together into one thing. For a long time, it actually worked in such a way where Sentry would be compiled and then Get Sentry would be compiled as two separate bundles. And then for them to interop, we had this really, really janky, like we would export a bunch of stuff onto the global window object. And then that's just like how they would communicate. I fixed that maybe 2.5 years ago. Because the other problem with that is you couldn't in Get Sentry import any components from Sentry without exporting them onto the window object. It was really bad. Yeah, don't do that. All right. So I mentioned we don't use too much less anymore. We use emotion. I know that the kind of CSS and JS thing can be a little bit of a hot topic. Maybe not so much these days, I'm not sure. But I've definitely talked to people that are like, why are you doing that? So we found that in kind of a larger code base, which Sentry is, I think in maybe the description of this talk, we calculated Sentry as like 230,000 lines of code or something like that of just front end code. So we kind of found that using some type of like styled component thing where you can kind of maintain your JavaScript right next to the CSS that is powering the UI elements has been really, really valuable in terms of like maintainability, just code discoverability to be able to understand that this thing is coupled to this thing. That said, even though we're kind of using these style components, I think one of the kind of biggest pieces of hate against them is kind of like, oh, you're not using the cascading part of CSS. I did want to point out that you actually can still very much take kind of like use the cascading stuff even when you're using these style components. And like one example of that that I've found really powerful is using CSS variables with style components. So to be able to still like basically have a bunch of style components set up, but then have these CSS variables at some top level that easily control things without having to like kind of have a bunch of like JavaScript variables that you're passing around. And the really, really nice thing about CSS variables, obviously, if you didn't know, is that they cascade, which is really great. We're using emotion. We're not using style components. As far as I can tell, they're more or less the same thing these days. Maybe there's like some subtle differences that I don't know about, but at the time when we chose to use emotion, I think 2 years ago, style components actually were not as performant as emotion. So that's kind of why we ended up with emotion. I think Kent Dodds, the author of React Testing Library, and I think a number of other things, also had this tweet. I found this when I was trying to like validate our reasoning for using emotion. I just want to put this in here. Other important people say it's good. So what else? We use React Router. This was kind of like a little kind of tip that I wanted to put in here is, this is very, kind of classical tip is, don't fix what's not broken. So we're actually still on the third version of React Router. If you're familiar with React Router, you probably know that it has undergone quite a bit of churn in terms of like structure and how to use it. So with React Router 3, you would put all of your routes kind of in one place. With React Router 4, you put your routes in your components, and then other components that are rendered have their routes inside of them. So it's kind of like this, you put your routes kind of everywhere in your app. So we certainly considered migrating over to React Router 4, but we kind of determined that it would be harder to maintain, probably harder to navigate. And a lot of this kind of came from our own experience using React Router 4 for side projects or other projects. And I think kind of what's almost maybe kind of funny to point out here is that because we've waited so long to migrate, and because we kind of like made this conscious decision not to change anything, because it works fine, it works great for us. I think maybe the biggest problem might be that our routes file is like 2,000 lines long. Though I did recently reorganize this, so it's quite a bit easier to like sort of navigate. My highlighting's broken, which is nice. But this is where all of our routes are, is in routes.tsx, which is really nice when when you're an engineer coming in and you're saying like, oh, I need to figure out what is rendering this page, right? To be able to just come in here and say like, oh, like where is the discover stuff? And it's like, here's the discover routes right here. And then you can, easily like navigate to like the thing, right? Like, oh, here's the landing. Whereas otherwise you'd have to like kind of traverse through a tree of like, okay, where does the organizations tree get rendered? Okay, where does the discover tree get rendered? Okay, where's the landing, right? But what I was gonna say is, so because we've waited so long, React Router 6 is gonna be coming out pretty soon, and they've actually returned to the all routes in one place kind of structure of creating your routing setup. So because we managed to wait so long, hopefully we can kind of migrate from 3 to 6 relatively easy-ishly. We'll probably have to fix a bunch of like types. I think we use the with router HOC stuff kind of heavily. And I think there's no longer an HOC, it's only hooks, which is something else that we're kind of moving towards. Yeah, a few other kind of like little things here. I guess I'll talk about the bottom one first is we just use fetch these days. So this is actually kind of recent, but we killed off jQuery's Ajax along with like maybe like 3 or 4 other usages of jQuery that we still sort of had floating around. I think I introduced like a old jQuery compatibility thing where I just re-implemented. It was like 2 things that we were using jQuery for, and they were really simple, but I don't remember what they were. Fetch works great. I highly recommend it. You honestly almost don't need other fetching libraries other than fetch, as far as I can tell from our usage. The other thing that we use is Reflux, which is a very, very old kind of like Flux state management library. It's not Redux. Don't confuse it with that. It's a lot of people do kind of tend to confuse with that. But we use that as kind of our global state management. And when I say global state management, I mean like asynchronous like states, so like server states, like when, for example, if you have 2 components on the same page and they're both fetching the same thing, you want to use some kind of global state thing so that you can deduplicate those requests. We use it for that. We're looking to replace it with something else, something, for example, like React Query, which kind of does that, but is newer. So the fact that it's kind of older kind of inherently has some problems. A lot of it has to do with like testing. So it's actually kind of hard to use Reflux with things like React Testing Library when you're using functional components with hooks, mostly because it happens all outside of the React rendering cycles. So like, Reflux it's basically like like I said, it's like the Flux thing. So you have like a store, and then you can listen to that store, and then you can have like actions that cause updates, and then all the subscribers will, that are listening will re-render, or well, they won't re-render, they'll be notified, and then you have to implement the re-rendering logic yourself, which is sort of what we've done. In fact, I think we recently managed to turn it into like a pretty simple hook kind of recently. So you can pass in one of these stores into this hook. And because of how nice hooks have been, you can simply listen to the store and then have it basically set state. But the annoying thing here is because it happens outside of React's lifecycle, you have to make sure when you're running tests that you're telling React that you're acting when you update your store. Otherwise, the set state will happen without any sort of act, and it will get confused, or really it will yell at you. I'm sure we've all seen the missing act warnings, or maybe you haven't if you're just using a bunch of like newer stuff that handles all that for you. But yeah, so this is something we're trying to get rid of. We also use it for global state for things like, I don't know, like we have a sidebar that you can open and close. It probably shouldn't be used for that. Something like React Context would probably make a lot more sense. Yeah, and then obviously we use Sentry. Hopefully at this point in the talk, you know what that is. David gave a really great demo earlier, but it works really well to be able to, see if we've broken anything. Yeah, so
I'll pause you right here. We got a question from the Discord. We got M. Hayes. He asked, for your routes, do you have any kind of helpers for generating URLs within your components?
We don't actually.
Yeah.
That's a good question. So that was actually something that I thought about when I joined. I was like, hey, why don't we have this? And I actually thought it was gonna be kind of like a problem, because we do that on the back end. So we use Django. So we have like all the kind of like Django helper stuff for like generating routes based on route names. So we don't do anything in the front end. I think it hasn't been a problem for us, honestly, because, well, we haven't moved routes around quite at all, right? Like if we do move routes around, we're pretty careful to make sure we have redirects.
Yeah.
So we haven't run into that scenario where it's like, oh, we need to kind of migrate where a route lives. And then it's, frustrating to go back through the app and like try and find all the hard coded paths, which is what we do. We do more or less just hard code the paths. But it hasn't really been a problem, I guess.
It's been okay for now.
Yeah.
Perhaps in the future, something to revisit.
Yeah, we definitely have a number of kind of like, where are they? The legacy redirects routes. So we have this whole route tree of
just a bunch of redirects,
things that are redirecting to other paths that are just because we move things around.
But I don't think, when we change stuff in code, usually it's not like we don't use these redirects anymore. I think this is typically for people who have like bookmarks, and
Yeah.
so I think we're pretty good about refactoring. So everything uses like the new routes. So
Yeah.
this is what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's a good question though. Thank you. Cool. Okay, let's keep going. So we kind of talked about kind of what we use to build Sentry, like some of the tooling. I did want to talk about kind of a few things that we particularly like at Sentry in terms of just like, being a front-end engineer and like, thinking about, how can we scale front-end engineering at Sentry? How can we make sure that, as we've grown as an organization, how do we, keep being productive? So I mentioned earlier that we really like TypeScript. I personally also really like TypeScript. If you read my likes earlier, I think the first thing I wrote was TypeScript. I'm a big convert. Before we migrated over, I hadn't actually used TypeScript, and we started using it. I'm like, oh, it seems like so much work. But at this point in my life, my development career, I don't know. I feel like I'm just like writing TypeScript all the time.
Older and wiser now.
I'm just older and wiser. So let's see. I don't know. Why do we love TypeScript so much? So TypeScript is really valuable for when you have, it's very valuable for when you have like a larger app, right? And Sentry, obviously, it's like we've grown our code base quite a bit, but it's like not only have we grown like how much code we're writing, but we have more and more people writing code, right? And I mentioned earlier, like people are specializing more in like front end, and the teams are kind of like doing specific things, and so maintainability becomes like a very, very real kind of priority. And so the idea that we can use something like TypeScript to have like static checking and to be able to basically eliminate whole classes of bugs, no more, object does not have property on undefined or whatever type things is really, really valuable. And it's very much true that we have eliminated those bugs. Like, obviously we use Sentry. And so it was very easy to see like the kinds of bugs we were introducing before versus the kinds of bugs we introduce now, where honestly, it's, don't have too many front end bugs these days. I think we used to have things like that where it would be like weird object types floating around and stuff like that. But ever kind of since we had kind of completed our migration to TypeScript where things are correctly typed, just like 100% of the time, it's kind of eliminate all that stuff. But the other part of it is kind of like the kind of very appealing part of TypeScript is that not only does it kind of stop you from writing code that is buggy, but you also can end up being like more productive, and especially like it's really important to make new contributors productive quickly. So it's more than just like a correctness checking thing, right? It's more than just like, oh, like we know that the code's not going to break type thing. It's also that like TypeScript offers these really, really great features that you almost might not even think about if you're just like in VS Code all day and already using it. But things like for example, like near always correct auto imports, where it will almost always know how to auto import like something that you need, right? So if I'm just like floating over here in some file and it's like, oh, I need this thing, and we'll see if my LSP works here or not.
Oh, no.
There we go.
Yeah.
So it's like if I needed to use projects, right, I can click this, hit enter, and it correctly imports it, right? So before we used TypeScript, I remember I specifically had like editor plugins for auto importing JavaScript modules, like because I was just tired of like having to be like, oh, I need to use projects, like, oh, let me come up here, import, use, and right, like I didn't want to do that anymore. And I think VS Code, if you're using JavaScript, kind of does something similar. Though I think at this point it actually might just run the TypeScript server for you, even though you don't have like type annotation, it would be mostly correct. But yeah, I remember using plugins that were like specifically around like auto importing based on like heuristics of like matching the file name to like what you're importing. And like it kind of worked, but it just wasn't very good. So things like that. I think one of the kind of like biggest like productivity like advantages of TypeScript is how easy it is to navigate. So to be able to like do go-to definition, to be able to find all references of a used like export, right? Like those two things are like really, really incredibly valuable, and like things that like very much you take kind of like granted for it, to be able to just jump around code really fast and like do that correctly, right? Like to be able to just be in here and be like, there's nothing too interesting here, but like, oh, like where's this common store interface thing used? And it's like, oh, here's the definition for it, right? And then to be able to say like, oh, well, what's using it, right? And to be able to just like hit a keyboard shortcut and see like, oh, here's all of the usages of this common store interface, right? This is related to our Reflux thing. This is like how this hook has like its own interface for using the stores. Yeah, I don't know. So that's like a very, very valuable thing that like I think that people kind of like almost take for granted. The other thing that I wanted to mention is why I put it in bold here is that it makes refactoring things really, really safe. I think David kind of has an example a little bit later here about just how you can be sure that if you are changing something that you've changed it all everywhere, right? Like, you know, we had that question a second ago about the URLs, and it's like I almost actually kind of wish that we had type checking on the URLs, right? Like to be able to like say like if you've changed the URL, then it's no longer valid in these places, right? Like that's basically what TypeScript does for you. If you're changing like object types or changing, you know, removing properties, you can immediately know that like you're not using it somewhere that you didn't expect. Which without TypeScript, you honestly don't know. You have to like kind of like search through the code. And especially with languages like JavaScript, where it's dynamic, it's not uncommon to, you know, like have weird indirection where you're like doing it some other way. So like, you know, just searching through the code base might not work.
Yeah.
I wanted to briefly mention too, this is kind of like, I think, sort of like a behind the scenes thing, but this is also like something that I put like in my likes, but the thing that powers editors is language server protocol. So I think it's also built by Microsoft. Is really, really cool because, you know, TypeScript, basically what you do is TypeScript has this little language server thing that runs and it implements this protocol. And then all these editors, all they have to do is implement this protocol and they get all that kind of like semantic, you know, navigation, semantic importing, all that stuff for free, which is in this case why I'm over here running NeoVim. I think a number of people at Sentry are in NeoVim land, like 3 or 4 people. Most people I would definitely say are in VS Code land.
Yeah, like me.
Yeah, but it's really nice that you can just install a plugin here and then get, you know, correct like semantic stuff like in your editor and be able to like type stuff and have it autocomplete. Kind of neat. Do you have a question, David? I feel like I saw some stuff scrolling along the screen there.
We do. We have M. Hayes back at it. He's saying, do you use TypeScript to check your API requests and responses?
That's another great question. Oh man, hit us with the hard ones. Yeah. I actually wish I could say yes to that. This is something that we were kind of like talking about, and it's sort of maybe like up in discussion a little bit. But no, we don't yet. We do in some places, but we don't do it in a sort of like automated way. Like I said, we don't use GraphQL or anything like that, where a lot of times it will auto generate all that stuff. We are kind of still just in kind of the old school like REST style like APIs. We do type them sometimes where we'll type the responses. That said, obviously it'd be very easy for those to go out of sync.
Yeah.
It's definitely a topic that we've talked about, but we haven't, you know, particularly taken any action on it quite yet. But we would definitely like to. If you have the opportunity to do that, if you're starting fresh on a new project and it's a project that you anticipate becoming a little bit larger, I do think it would be worth it. I think TypeScript is worth it on any project, even if it's small. I mentioned it's really valuable in Sentry because we're big, but I use it on all my side projects now.
Same here.
Yeah. No, that's a good question though.
Yeah, thank you.
One other thing I want to talk about here, and I'm going to kind of start moving a little faster because I realize we're taking longer than expected to talk here. One cool thing that we built kind of recently is deploy previews. And this is like kind of another valuable thing, I think, for the kind of like front end developer experience. So I think we built this during Hack Week, maybe 2-ish years ago. I don't know, time's unclear now because of COVID. But the idea of this is, you know, we kind of found that, you know, people would go and build code or, you know, go and build features on the front end. And a lot of times you'd have to like kind of pull those things down from a branch and like verify them locally, kind of set up test data locally. And so it was actually me and a couple other people worked on this project for Hack Week, where it's like, hey, can we just like, you know, we almost have a front end SPA here, or like, you know, a single page app. We almost have this like, you know, just JavaScript thing that talks to a backend API. Can we just like rip out a bunch of the tendrils that are like touching Django code and make it so that it runs on its own? With obviously the advantages of being, you know, if we, you know, automatically deploy pull requests to some, you know, server somewhere, then you can easily verify things, right? I put a little note here. It's actually, I realized this kind of recently, but it's actually especially useful for things like Dependabot automatic PRs. So if you configure Dependabot to just open PRs every time like packages update, it's actually really nice to be able to just like let that happen and then see like, oh, it updated like, I don't know, like the React like tooltip library or whatever that we're using. And then, you can just click it and make sure like all the tooltips still look right, make sure all the tests are passing, and then feel pretty confident that that upgrade's probably okay. Yeah, how do we build this? So this did require quite a bit of untangling in terms of like the way that like the back end rendered HTML would like boot the React app. So kind of like I mentioned, like at the time we were still kind of coupled to Django, so we had to introduce a few new APIs, things for like really early boot configuration. So think things like locale or like user details, or even like the Sentry configuration for the Sentry DSN that it needs to know to send errors to. We had to add authentication pages. Like I mentioned, our authentication pages are still in kind of like Django land. Our authentication pages are actually quite complicated. There's a number of different ways that you can authenticate. So we built those just for the deploy previews, and they're like kind of dumb and basic. But then yeah, so Webpack learns to produce HTML. You can tell Webpack to build this kind of like single page mode version of the app, and it will produce an HTML file that has all the JavaScript. And then kind of like a little bit of the secret magic sauce is where can we put this stuff so that's easy. So we did this during a hack week, and we wanted somewhere that this stuff could live where we didn't have to do a bunch of like oh, it has to deploy to a server, and then it has to set up an automatic subdomain, and then it has to connect over to the Sentry API somehow. We found Vercel to be really nice for this. So it kind of handles all that magic where it automatically will see PRs, automatically deploy them, automatically put them in a subdomain, automatically build all the Webpack stuff. And that actually kind of just worked. Whereas like that was actually kind of a big unknown when I had started that Hack Week project, and it just worked, which is great. But it's nice to have like real data that you can test against. So it talks to the production API. So basically what it does, it will proxy through the Vercel page that it's on, and then it will talk to the real Sentry API. And the other nice thing that it gives us is I think it has some nice like permission controls so that outside contributors can't like make a PR with some malicious thing and then send people links to these pages that sort of look like Sentry. So that's nice. Developer previews are really cool and really useful, I think. One of the things we thought about, I think not too long after we built this, is like, hey, like, can we do more with that? Like we did this, we basically separated Sentry out. So it's kind of like a full, SPA over here and then backend thing over here for the most part. So we thought like, hey, can we do a little bit more? And one of the things that, like I said, we mentioned, as the engineering organization grows, so does specialization. So, you have more and more people working just on the front end. So it was like, hey, can we actually do this where you can only run the front end locally then? So the question was, can we just do what we did with pull request previews and just do that in the development environment, right? Like why have to wait for Docker to boot all this backend stuff if you can just have your local development environment just talk to the production API? So the answer obviously is yes, you can do that. And so we introduced this dev UI command, which I've actually used quite a bit since I've mostly just been doing front end these days. And I think a lot of people use quite a bit. Yeah, and it's really nice because it boots fast. You don't have to wait for a bunch of Docker stuff to run. Your machine's running less things, which is nice, especially in the scenario where you have a TypeScript compiler that has to keep a bunch of stuff in memory. And it can be really nice to use the production API, like locally to test things where it's like you already have real data, so you don't have to mock a bunch of stuff out. So yeah, that was one other kind of thing that we had built locally or built kind of like for our development tooling that we really liked. Yeah, so I think from here I'm going to hand it over to David. He's got some kind of like war stories to tell.
Yep. Before that, we actually have one question from Rema.
All right.
How many hack weeks we have, like in the duration, I guess, like how frequently we have it. So I just say it's once a year and it's 1 week, typically in the fall. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. Once a year, it's a lot of cool stuff gets built. I think we built that another one of the years. I didn't talk about this. I want to talk about this, but we built a whole kind of visual snapshotting tool. So where it generates screenshots and automatically compares them on pull requests, kind of similar to what Percy does, but
our own version, basically.
Our own version, yeah.
Yeah, we built a lot of cool things. But back to this story time. So this is how we use Sentry for Sentry. And basically describing how we've been able to get some performance wins and how we use Sentry performance product specifically. So in order to understand and get the context here, we want to flash back to 2019. This is, when the app basically had a couple performance issues that we're going to talk about. And one of them is caused because on app startup, the organization details is fetched. And this is all happening in one endpoint. So the organization details is composed of a couple different pieces of information. So we have the organization information, that's like the slug, the avatar, and the plan, maybe some features that you had for like an early access organization that you can turn on. And then we also have the set of all your teams in the organization and the set of all your projects in the organization. And that is stored as, normalized field within this organization object. So it's organization.teams and organization.projects. And this is stored in Reflux. Like Evan talked about, we have Reflux. It's not the greatest right now, but we have this to store API data, since typically you don't want to be fetching this multiple times. It's a rather heavy payload, so we don't fetch it multiple times. And the way it's accessed is we store it in this store, and then downstream components will go ahead and directly access teams and projects from the organization. So now, bigger and bigger customers started using Sentry in 2019. And obviously, as any company, you'll start to get bigger and bigger customers. And we started to see that the organization details endpoint is becoming very expensive. So expensive, in fact, that some customers are subjected to 15 seconds of load time, which is a lot. It's like really a lot. And this is nowhere near acceptable, I feel like. Typically, they would just see this loading spinner for 15 whole seconds. So obviously, this is a huge problem. It's not so bad. Like, it's not every single customer, but it is a select few larger customers that obviously we care a lot about. So this is something that we definitely need to get to the root of. And how exactly did we do that? So as I mentioned before, we have our own performance and distributed tracing product, and it collects a variety of metrics like throughput, latency, and transaction duration, which is something we'll be looking at today, which is how long a transaction takes, maybe like an endpoint or like a page load transaction. And then we've also recently introduced Web Vitals, like you saw, so LCP, FCP, which are also pretty related to this case, because ultimately we're trying to reduce those numbers as well. So let's go ahead and click into Sentry, and this is some screenshots of actual data that we have. I've blurred out the customer name, so that's why you see like a little bit of white out here. That's not like a visual glitch. So we have a page load transaction, and this is specifically for like any page load that we have. I think this is for the issues page though. This is the most typical page load, and you can immediately see a very long bar. This is the span view, so this is showing kind of the operations that take place in the front end. And all of these are like HTTP GET requests, or like, rendering something or getting, a script. You can see we have a 7 seconds endpoint. So it's not as bad as I talked about, but there are some very bad cases. This is probably not the worst. 7 seconds just loading this, having this loading indicator and loading this endpoint, get API/0/organizations, right? And this is the specific organization that they're requesting details from. So because this is distributed tracing, we can connect the front end to the back end. So we can click into this and see that the back end transaction in Django looks a little different. And I'm going to open that up right now. And we have basically the culprit right here, right? So we click into the back end transaction, and we see that part of the reason why it takes 7 seconds is because most of it is constituted by this 6.6 second project summary serializer operation. So as you heard before, in this organization endpoint, we basically have all the teams and all the projects. And for this specific organization, they have a lot of projects. So serializing all of them and sending that over the network is going to be very, very costly. So sweet, we've kind of found out that this project summary serializer is a huge bottleneck in performance. So what is the solution here? We're going to go ahead and try to split the organization details endpoint into multiple parts. And even though we're doing the same amount of work, the important thing to note here is that in the previous span view, you saw that the whole application was blocking on that one really heavy endpoint. But if we split it up into multiple pieces, we can block on just the one lightweight organization details, which is only composed of like strings and numbers and IDs. So it's super, lightweight, as the name implies. And then the all projects and all teams API call can still happen in the background, but it shouldn't be blocking any of the app from loading, right? We want to render as much as we can with as little information as possible to make it feel, as snappy as you can. And I think the thing is also that Sentry, like a lot of the views, don't actually require all projects and all teams to render, which is something that we're currently tackling. We're going to talk more about later, but we really don't need all this information just to load, a simple issues page, right? So in order to do this migration, took quite a bit of work. So we have this incremental migration in place. We have tons of files that use the organization.projects and organization.teams directly. So first we have to separate those two constructs into their own stores, right? We have to fetch them separately. And then we have to ensure before we can migrate these views to use this new pattern, it has to use these new stores and they have to be eligible for migration. And this is something that TypeScript made a lot easier, but this migration was also happening in the midst of the TypeScript migration. So this did end up taking like a year long, and that's partially because we didn't have TypeScript for some of these verifications. But the way this worked is we had two routing trees. We had a lightweight and a heavyweight routing tree, and I'll go ahead and switch over to an actual pull request. This one that I did a while ago. And you can see that we have this lightweight organization detail. So this was the very introduction of this lightweight pattern where we had a component that was responsible for fetching this lightweight organization, the all projects and all teams, and then put those all into the stores so that components could actually interact with them, right? So that's just the history right there. It's really real. We had this lightweight and heavyweight thing. And so after we were able to get some of those high traffic views in, we started seeing performance gains. So again, this is another example, obviously really bad 13-second load time. You can see we have the same thing over here, this same GET request, and it's pushing all these spans over to the right. Right? Nothing else can happen until this huge endpoint is done loading. So this is super bad. And then we have the new world where the equivalent request is quite a bit faster. So it goes from 13,000 milliseconds to 281 milliseconds. And you can see everything else is not blocked anymore. Though you will notice that there are some very bad examples of these call to all projects and all teams. These two long bars are those endpoints. Obviously not great that we have those, but it's unfortunate for now. But at least you can see that the app is able to render, which is a huge improvement. And then what did we do after we performed like some of these migrations? Well, we need to continue the process, right? So we got these initial gains, but we need to migrate everything over into the lightweight organization. And during this cleanup phase, I feel like this is kind of like a two-phase thing. We no longer had to maintain this construct of heavyweight and lightweight, which was really nice. Obviously, having this in, the code is not the clearest, because engineers would come on and be like, why are there two versions of this organization?
Yeah, for a long time, I didn't even know what lightweight org was. Like you did it and I was just like, why do we have two organizations now?
Yeah, there's definitely the issue of education. I remember people would ping me, like they'd get blamed. They see this lightweight thing. They're like, what the heck is going on here? Which one do I use? So having that in for a year, not the greatest, but we're super glad to be able to get rid of it. And Evan can talk more about how you use TypeScript there if you have any questions. But yeah, we use TypeScript. We got rid of all these organization.projects and organization.teams. And now we're focused on even further composition or further decomposition, really. You're probably thinking, why the heck are you even fetching all projects and all teams? Is probably not necessary in a super big organization. And you're exactly correct. We definitely shouldn't be doing that. So we're trying to even move away from that. A lot of the time we have these components that just get the user teams, for example, or just get the user's projects, but they end up filtering that from the set of all projects. So this is not that efficient. So what are some of the tools that we can use to make this a little bit nicer? And this is where we introduce the idea of hooks more readily in our application. So we have a really old React code base, right? So a lot of our components are in the old style, like just class components. We even had like Create React class that we recently got rid of. So super old stuff. How can we even make use of this hooks, which can only be used in functional components? Well, we have some examples here. So I'm going to fire up my editor real quick in this VS Code. You can see we have this use teams hook, and this is right here. And it supports a number of options, which is a limit for the number of teams that you want to paginate to, maybe specific slugs that you want, and whether or not you just want the user teams. And this is where we abstract away all the fetching and interaction with the store. If we scroll through this, you can see there's a bunch of code for interacting with the store and providing the right stuff. And how do we end up using this in a class component? Well, we have this kind of thing, this render props teams utility, and it really has no logic within it, which I think is really nice. So we have all the logic separated into this hook. All it does is it just forwards whatever you get from use teams, so our hook, and it gives it to the children as an argument. And so this is a way that you can use it as a render prop style, which is a little bit older. Obviously, if you can just use hooks, it's great if you're using like a new project. But I thought this was a cool way that we were able to kind of integrate hooks slowly and have this new path forward. So we're kind of on a, like a more modern path, and we can still have all the old class components using our new logic. And of course, there's stuff that we've already highlighted before, like use legacy store, which has been super helpful and kind of abstracting away all the reflux stuff. So eventually, when we make the switch over, it is not as jarring, right? We can kind of put this all into a little box and with abstract away the logic.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what's going on there. And of course, tools that made it easier, TypeScript, that's a given. And following up with the actual, some more performance gains, some more pats on the back, we have recently migrated over the settings view from the heavyweight to the lightweight organization. And this is kind of the last step. This is not a very heavily trafficked view. Not a lot of people are like going into this page from the start. So we kind of deprioritize this to the very end. But as you can see, we're able to get 61% speed improvement. This is using the performance trends feature, which takes a time period, splits it in half, looks at the before and after, does some statistical methods, and basically tells you whether or not there's a real trend here. And as you can see, there is a pretty clear trend for faster load times.
And it's pretty cool too, because this is like, we didn't have to like go and specifically look for this. This just was one of those things where we did it, and then we looked at the performances trends page, and it was just there.
Yeah,
exactly. And it was like, oh look, there's that thing we did, right?
Yeah,
It's actually pretty. I was like, it was one of those moments where I was like, man, our product's really good.
yeah. But, it's quite useful, I'd say. Definitely be able to go in here and just view at a glance what's changing is very nice. So yeah, that's how we do performance here at Sentry. I think bring it all together. I'll just talk about one last thing. So I mentioned at the very start that we're 2 engineers on, a team of maybe like 80 engineers total.
Yes,
and we're not the only people who interact with the front end, obviously. So how do we actually go in and do all these changes that are kind of like wide sweeping, cross team, cross organization? We have something called the front end TSC. And what does that even stand for? Well, TSC stands for Technical Steering Committee. And it's a bi-weekly meeting that anyone can join if they're interested in kind of influencing the direction of the front end code base. So if you have opinions, you can come here and talk all about them. You can just represent your product team, and you can talk about the specific issues that you've been facing, and then propose, debate, and approve initiatives. And it just ensures that we're building Sentry in basically, in a cohesive manner, right? We have some harmony here in the front end. We don't have like really clashing patterns everywhere. And this is actually the birthplace of multiple initiatives, right? So we have the TypeScript thing. This migration was something that we gathered all the TSC individuals, and we really had like some good spirit about it. We're all participating in this.
People didn't want to do it at first. I was like one of the people. I was like, yeah, we don't know if we really need that, right? It was like, oh, we use it in the SDK because those are like consumer things, but. And then I remember, I think someone did it. I think like TypeScript literally came out as a Hack Week project, and then like someone just started doing it. And then like they came back to the TSC and they were like, hey, look, we converted this whole like part of the app over. I think it was like the initial version of Discover.
Yeah.
They converted that all the way over to like TypeScript. And then like they came back to the TSC and they're like, all right, guys, check this out, kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And I think that's how a lot of it goes at the TSC. We kind of have these initiatives. I feel like, Evan, you're someone who's like, I got to see it to believe it. Yeah. So we'll end up doing things where we'll like, have a pull request up that's like, this is how good it could look, and that's how things like React testing library got in. Hooks was also something that we talked about in the TSC. We removed a lot of old code as well. We have initiatives for that. So removing React Bootstrap, that's out of there. Reflexbox, we're done with that. And then the ESLint rules, many are born and they also die here. And many, many more. We have a whole like Notion board. That's what we use internally. You can see the whole list of everything that we've approved, rejected. It's not really the whole list because you can scroll and there's like tons more.
Yeah.
But this is everything that we're working on here.
Yeah. No, the front end TSC has definitely been like super valuable. I remember like when we just started the TSC, I think it was, so when did we do this? It was like maybe 3.5 years ago. It was pretty early on in my tenure here that we like formed the TSC. I remember like one of the first ESLint rules that we added was just like always use const, or no, what was it? It was like use const over let kind of thing, where it's like only use let if you have to. Even that, I remember people were like, oh, it's like another extra character.
For sure.
But then it was like, once you manage to get the ESLint rule in, everyone just like stops complaining, right? It's the same thing with like, Prettier, where it's like, as long as everything's consistent, like, no one's gonna complain kind of thing. So it's actually been really nice to like have like a formal, like kind of like working group for that, where we meet and talk about it, and like, sometimes it really does get like into the nitty gritty details of like, what, I don't know, like we've talked about colors pretty in depth in there too. There's
a lot of things, very small decisions that take up a lot of time, but I think they're super useful. And I think we both recommend having this kind of meeting, at any organization that has like a, a growing code base like this.
Yeah. So, had to bring it back to the people here right at the end.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you to all the people.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty much it, what we had in this talk. When we were putting this together, we kind of, you might notice that kind of the intro was like, we're going to talk about like so much code stuff. And then we realized, oh God, we only have an hour here. So we kind of reduced it down to just like, kind of how we build things. And, here's kind of a pretty interesting story. But yeah, if anyone had any more questions or wanted to ask us anything, I think we're here for another 5 minutes, and we can certainly, talk about stuff. Feel free to type things in the Discord and we can answer them.
Yeah, or we can
Um,
unmute on Zoom. I think. I
Yeah,
don't know if it's
maybe I don't know. I
possible.
don't know if that's like allowed or
If
not.
you're brave enough, right? I don't know.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll just like hang out here and talk more about. I don't know what are some. Oh, someone's typing something.
No, we
Let's
got
let's
rainbow
see.
typing.
Let's see what we got.
No pressure.
No pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming to the talk. Hopefully you learned something about how we do coding here and maybe took away some good lessons, right? We don't do everything perfectly, but we're always trying to evolve
Yeah.
and maintain things properly.
Definitely, like being proactive about maintainability has been like super valuable here. Like I've certainly seen places before where maintainability becomes more of like a reactive thing where things just start to become like really hard to. Oh yeah, I guess people are.
Oh, did we miss things in the Zoom chat? Should we open that up? I don't know if we, do you want to open that Zoom chat up?
One here. Let's answer these 40 questions.
Okay.
Are there plans to include local variables in the stack trace on JavaScript SDK? That's a good question. I don't know the answer, so unfortunately, neither me nor David work too closely with the SDK teams. I would recommend hopping in there's a Sentry Discord where a lot of our SDK engineers hang out and kind of like talk about all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I actually don't know why we don't have local variables. It actually honestly might be a limitation of the kind of like JavaScript runtime. So it actually might be really difficult to capture that stuff. I know the Python SDK does it pretty well, which has always been really nice. Yeah. What's the other question we got here? What client library do you use? Are you moving to? Are you talking about
State management?
Yeah, are you talking about state management, or are you talking specifically more about things like React Query? Ruskies.
We'll get the reply to that.
Yeah, we'll get the reply to that, and we'll answer another one here. Any difficulty testing hooks with React testing library? So we kind of recently have started like introducing hooks and using hooks. So I think over the last maybe 5-6 months now, we've been kind of introducing hooks into our code base. I think I introduced the React hook testing library, which is a part of the React testing library. And I've really liked it. Actually, I think it makes it really easy to test hooks. Whereas like kind of before when we had anything that we even sort of like hooks, where it'd be things like HOCs, you always had to like set up mock components and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I haven't had too much difficulty testing hooks. The thing that has been annoying actually is like testing components that are using hooks, I guess.
Oh yeah.
So testing components that use hooks, it's kind of like, well, a lot of it, like I said, kind of has to do with the fact that we're using these kind of older Reflex stores, which don't integrate with like the React lifecycles. So that's been annoying. Are you doing integration testing? Yes, we are. So we have a whole suite of kind of integration tests that are run by Selenium on it's part of the backend code base test, but basically it runs the whole application. And then it does a number of things. So not only does it do like integration tests where it like, clicks around and verifies things, but it actually also takes screenshots. And I mentioned earlier that we have built out kind of our own visual regression testing thing where it will compare the screenshots from the master branch to the screenshots from your branch, and you can actually see like visually if anything is different.
Yeah.
It's really nice, to be honest, to be able to like see like if you change some component, like if you change like a glow component and that changes some styles somewhere, it might change somewhere weird. I think I mentioned like we use style components, so we don't have too much like CSS where you change one thing and then it changes like 100 different things, which is kind of what the visual regressions test against. Yeah, we do have integration tests. We also I guess have some like kind of JavaScript integration tests where we test some components that that are just using a whole bunch of components all together.
Yeah.
Most of our JavaScript tests are unit tests though.
Yeah, we have them for the larger components. Definitely. And we have how do code reviews work for the front end? Also, what's the process for deploying front end code to production?
So, the deploying question is actually pretty good. We're in the kind of midst of changing that as well.
Yeah.
But so how do front end code reviews work? I don't know. Do you want to take this one, David?
Yeah, I can talk about it. I mean, front end code review, it's like is the same as any code review that we have. We just put up a pull request on GitHub, and then we actually have GitHub owners. So we have like basically whenever you do a pull request, which if you modify any files that are owned by another team, then it'll put them on as a reviewer. And then you just do I guess, the review that way. You just get the comments and revise. And then for the front end production deploys, we actually have something where we're recently trying to split out the deploys into the front end and back end. So typically, if you make front end code changes, you actually have to deploy both the front end and the back end. But now we're changing it so that you only have to deploy the front end if it's just front end changes, and that makes it like a lot quicker. And that's something that as the person who is responsible for a lot of like the visual snapshot and the preview builds is working on right now. And we have that, I think that we're internally testing it right now.
All right, I've opened up the Zoom chat. I see that we've got a few questions over here.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
How do you measure page load consistently? This is from Giorgio. How do you measure page load consistently with Sentry in a single page app, i.e. making sure all the requests you consider to part of the page load are waited for to part of the page load?
Yeah, I can take this. So I think this is a problem that I encountered when I was doing some of the performance work before. And this is something that you can manually instrument, which is something that I did initially. So you just manually instrument. So you say, okay, once the application has reached this state, so once it's got a return from all these API endpoints and you know it's rendered, either in like the component did update or like something like that. That's like a bit older, but once you get all the information, you can put like a mark and connect that up with Sentry, and you can do it that way. You can also just rely on like the Google Web Vitals, which I think is kind of what we're trying to lean towards. We're trying to make it more automated like that. So things like FCP and LCP, I don't know if you're familiar with those Web Vitals, but you can see the strategy that the browsers use to actually determine when that point has been reached. And I think for LCP, which is largest contentful paint, typically it's correct for at least the things that we're trying to measure. So it won't say that the loading spinner is like the largest contentful paint. It will usually say like the biggest block of text, which happens once you load the issues page. And that kind of correlates strongly with user experience. So we try to lean more towards that because we think that's like kind of like the semantic way to represent like performance, saying that once the largest thing is loaded, then we can consider it loaded. And usually the largest thing is the actual thing that we want the users to see. So yeah, that's like kind of the way that we've tackled that.
Yeah, and it is like a lot of that kind of stuff happens over in the SDK. So, but yeah, definitely the FCP LCP stuff.
Yeah,
especially now since like I think I don't remember when this happened or if it has already happened, but I think Google was changing their page rank algorithm where you'll get ranked lower if your LCP is bad. Yeah, so that's part of the reason that this has become like kind of important, right? Is if it actually takes a long time for your large paint. I can't remember if it's LCP or FCP. It might be a combination of both.
I can see that.
Probably FCP actually, since the first paint is probably the more important one.
True.
Let's see. We got another question over here in the chat. Do you only use React with the client side render, or do you only use React with client side rendering? Do you mix old templates with React? So yeah, so right now we do only use React on the client side. Like I said, we have kind of a Python Django backend. There probably is actually, I can imagine there might be some like crazy like integration thing where you can like run Node to like render, like render the server side stuff through Django with like some Node instance or something. I imagine that might be a thing. We don't do any sort of server side rendering. It definitely does have performance benefits to do that. It certainly could make things a lot faster. That said, because of the fact that the tech stacks are two separate things, I think it would be probably a lot of work to integrate something like that.
Yeah, I'd be very costly.
I might be wrong. I don't know. Maybe it is kind of easy. Maybe chat knows. But yeah, so right now it's pretty much all just client side. So kind of as I sort of implied, where it's like we have this kind of front end single page app, and then we have our back end thing. Do we mix kind of templated views with React stuff? Mostly no. So the way that it works right now is that Django renders this, I think the file is just called layout.html, where it's like really pretty bare bone. It used to have like a bit more stuff in it. It used to like render like things like alert bars at the top of the page. It doesn't do that anymore. That's all delegated to the front end app now. But it is the thing that loads the app and actually runs the app. I think we literally export like one or two things to the global window now, and I think one of them is like render app. Yeah. Though even some of that might have changed kind of with some of this front end deploy stuff that you mentioned that we're doing.
True, I don't know.
But we don't mix things for the most part. I think there's like maybe one or two places where we have like there's one thing that I can think of where we have the registration page, which is this is Sentry on premise only, by the way. The registration page for Sentry.io is completely different because it's on the marketing website.
Yeah.
But the registration page for the open source version of Sentry has a it has a password strength indicator, which is a React component that we export onto the window and then is rendered in that HTML view.
I see.
So there is a little teeny bit of
Yeah,
mixing like that, but it's it's pretty self-contained. Let's see. Oh, got a few more questions over here. Like internet client libraries, what method and requirements were you considering to create it now? So internal client libraries. I guess I'm still not exactly sure what internal client libraries means. Can you clarify a little bit more, Rusky? Let's see.
We have a clarification.
What version of Webpack are you using? Oh,
it's not 5. Are there?
Oh, I see. There is a clarification.
What libraries?
He's typing right now. Let's wait for it. We are using Webpack 5. It was maybe a little bit of work to migrate over to it, but it wasn't too bad. We're on the latest versions of most things.
Yeah, we try to keep it latest, except for select things like React Router and Reflux.
What do you keep template code? Maybe I'm still confused.
Yeah, I'm a little confused too.
Client libraries.
I mean, someone said that what client libraries would we use now? Like, say, for example, like we talked about how Reflux was bad.
I see what you're saying.
Like that.
Sorry,
I'm
thinking too. Yeah,
I think that's what. I mean, we can talk about that.
Yeah,
if that's not what you guys asked, we can talk about that. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I can speak kind of just like to my own experience. If we were to rebuild Sentry today, I guess it would certainly be kind of all the sort of mod stuff. So one of the things I guess I can specifically talk about is like, we want to get rid of this Reflux old thing. We probably wouldn't use Redux. My personal feeling of Redux is that there's a lot of boilerplate code there and it's kind of a little bit too much. We would probably use a good bit of React context, I think. Though I think there's also maybe some performance implications of using too much React context. But one of the libraries I've been super interested in recently that we've started to kind of like experiment with is React Query, which is kind of like a asynchronous data fetching library, though it doesn't actually do any of the fetching. I think you probably just use Fetch for that. But it kind of handles the deduplication of requests. It handles the caching. It handles reloading of data. Does a few more things. I actually don't know too much about it, but it looks very interesting to me. In terms of like other client libraries, I mean, I think like, React's great. What other stuff? I personally still like React Router 3. I mean, I don't know. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff, and we can even just like kind of look at our like package.json. We made a joke earlier how it's like, oh, we just walk through the whole package.json with everyone.
You just switch over to your.
Oh, you're right. But there is some kind of neat stuff in here that I think that we like. We have MobX in here. I think actually MobX is kind of like it's a pretty nice like library for kind of reactive things. I've actually used it in some of my side projects and I quite like it, but I will say it's a little bit harder to document than it is something like Reflux, which I think, or Redux, sorry, which is I think pretty good at documenting itself, despite being like tons of boilerplate code. One of the other things in here that we use that's kind of cool is like React Popper. This is a really cool library for doing like popovers and things like that. I also really like React Select. That's a really nice library. We use eCharts for all of our chart visualizations, and I think that's actually been impressively good considering how hard it is to do charts.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty solid.
Yeah, I don't know. We're just like talking about cool libraries these days or now. Let's see. Do we have any more questions over here? No.
I think we're.
Yeah, I think we'll probably wrap it up. I think we're a little like 10 minutes over time here. Cool. Like I said, definitely hop in. There's a Sentry Discord. Me and David are also in there. We can certainly answer more questions about front end, how we build front end. Sentry is totally open source. Go, read the source code. I've actually been adding quite a bit more like kind of comments recently to like kind of big core pages. So like, for example, I added
show what you got.
I added this whole big comment to the app index file, which explains just how the app even boots. Even though like literally this is like all it does. But this is actually kind of nice if you're just like looking at Sentry code or like browsing through it. This is kind of like a nice introduction to just the way it works. And yeah, same thing with like the routes file. I added like a whole big comment in here about like how the routes file is structured. this is kind of like another pro tip is like, add lots of like kind of README documentation into your code, because it's really, people will read that stuff. Sometimes not, but a lot of times they will.
We got some props. Thank you, Alicia Pi.
Yeah, thank you.
OVC API.
Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys like the talk. All right.